A single bullet tore through the jaw of a Texas cattleman on a dusty October morning in 1877, and the woman who fired it vanished into the borderlands before his blood pooled in the dirt. Her name was Belle Starr, though she had been born Myra Maybelle Shirley in a Missouri farmhouse 33 years earlier, and by the time lawmen pieced together what happened that day near the Canadian River, she had already crossed 3 state lines and changed horses twice. How does a woman raised on piano lessons and Southern etiquette become the most wanted female outlaw in the territories? And why did the frontier justice system seem unable or unwilling to bring her to account? The answer begins not with Belle herself, but with the forces that carved open the American frontier and created spaces where traditional law dissolved into something more volatile and personal. By 1860, the Louisiana Purchase territories were filling rapidly with settlers moving west along established routes, the Santa Fe Trail carrying merchants and families into lands that had been indigenous hunting grounds for millennia, and the Civil War about to detonate every assumption about order and allegiance. Missouri sat at the fault line between Union and Confederate sympathies, and in Carthage, where the Shirley family operated a tavern and livery stable, that divide ran straight through parlors and churches. When Confederate irregulars began raiding Union supply lines in 1861, they did not wear uniforms or follow conventional military discipline. They were guerrilla fighters, bushwhackers who knew every creek bed and abandoned barn, and among them rode Myra's older brother Edwin, who would be killed by Union militia before the war ended. The violence that consumed Missouri during those years was intimate and unforgiving, neighbor against neighbor, and it taught young Myra Shirley a lesson the finishing schools never offered, that survival often required choosing sides and that the line between patriot and outlaw depended entirely on who held power when the smoke cleared. After the war, Missouri was a ruin of burned farms and score settling, and families like the Shirleys faced a choice between rebuilding under federal occupation or heading into territories where the law was still being written. They chose Texas, relocating to the town of Syene near Dallas in 1866, joining a flood of ex-Confederates who saw the Southern Plains as a second chance, or at least a place to disappear. Myra was 20 years old, educated enough to quote Byron, skilled enough on horseback to outpace most men, and carrying the kind of anger that comes from watching everything familiar burn. In Texas, she met Cole Younger, one of the most notorious members of the James Younger Gang, a collection of former bushwhackers who had turned bank and train robbery into a borderlands industry. The connection was electric and dangerous. Younger was charming, violent, and constantly on the move, and whether Myra married him informally or simply lived as his partner remains disputed in the records. But by 1868, she had given birth to a daughter she named Pearl, a child. Cole never publicly acknowledged. If you are watching this because you want to know what really happened on the frontier, beyond the dime novels and Hollywood myths, then subscribe now because we dig into the primary sources, the court records and newspaper archives that reveal how violence and survival actually worked in the territories, and why the stories we have been told often miss the most important details. The James Younger Gang operated across a network of safe houses and sympathetic communities scattered through Missouri, Kansas, and the Indian Territory. A sprawling region that would later become Oklahoma, but in the 1870s was a patchwork of tribal jurisdictions, federal authority, and virtually no effective law enforcement. This was the zone Belle Starr learned to navigate. After Cole Younger drifted out of her life, she attached herself to other outlaws, not as a passive companion, but as someone who could hold property, manage logistics, and provide cover. In 1880, she married Sam Starr, a Cherokee man from a prominent family in the Indian Territory, and the union gave her something more valuable than romance: legal standing on tribal land. The Starr family had deep roots in the Cherokee Nation, and Sam's relatives included both respected leaders and known criminals, a duality that reflected the impossible position Native communities faced as white settlement pressured their sovereignty and federal policy swung between negotiation and dispossession. Belle and Sam settled on a remote ranch along the Canadian River they called Younger's Bend, a name that advertised Belle's past associations and signaled to every outlaw riding through that this was friendly territory. Younger's Bend became a way station for men fleeing posses, a place where stolen horses could be rebranded and where questions were not asked. Belle ran the operation with precision, keeping records vague enough to frustrate prosecutors but clear enough to collect debts, and her reputation grew in the telling. Newspapers in Fort Smith and Kansas City began publishing accounts of her exploits, some true, most exaggerated, and the image that took hold was irresistible to readers hungry for frontier sensation. A woman in velvet riding skirts and a plumed hat, carrying a revolver and quoting Shakespeare, a Confederate daughter turned bandit queen. The reality was grimmer and more calculating. Belle was arrested multiple times for horse theft and harboring fugitives, and the court records show a woman who understood the legal system well enough to exploit its gaps. Federal jurisdiction in the Indian Territory was a mess of overlapping authorities. Crimes committed by non-Indians often fell to the court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, presided over by Judge Isaac Parker, the so-called hanging judge. But crimes involving tribal members could be tried under Cherokee law, and the lines between the two systems were constantly contested. Belle used this ambiguity like a weapon, shifting her story depending on which court she faced, and more than once she walked free because prosecutors could not establish clear jurisdiction. But the violence that defined her life was not courtroom theater. It was sudden and personal. In 1886, Sam Starr was killed in a gunfight at a Christmas dance, shot by a lawman named Frank West in a dispute that began over cards and ended with both men dead in the dirt. Belle was a widow at 38, and the ranch at Younger's Bend lost its legal protection under Cherokee law because her claim had derived from Sam's tribal membership. She responded by marrying another Cherokee man, Jim July, who was 15 years younger and widely considered unstable. The marriage kept her on the land, but it also marked the beginning of her unraveling. July was violent and unpredictable, and neighbors reported hearing arguments that echoed across the river bottoms at night. By early 1889, Belle had accumulated enemies in every direction. She had testified against several former associates in federal court, turning informant to save herself, and in the outlaw networks of the Indian Territory, betrayal carried a sentence that no judge needed to pronounce. On February 3, 1889, she rode home alone from a trip to Fort Smith, her horse picking its way along a muddy trail through thick timber 2 miles from Younger's Bend. Somewhere in that stretch of woods, a shotgun blast knocked her from the saddle. She tried to crawl, the mud sucking at her sleeves, and a second shot ended it. Her horse wandered home that evening without her, and her body was found the next morning by a neighbor, her face pressed into the cold earth, the back of her skull opened by buckshot. No one was ever convicted of her murder. Suspicion fell on Jim July, on a Cherokee man named Edgar Watson, who had rented land from her and argued over the terms, and on any number of outlaws who had reason to fear her testimony. The investigation was cursory, hampered by jurisdictional confusion and the simple fact that many people in the territory felt Belle had been living on borrowed time. Judge Parker's court examined the case briefly, but without cooperative witnesses or physical evidence that could tie a suspect to the scene, the file went cold. Belle Starr was buried at Younger's Bend, her grave marked by a stone carved with a horse, a star, and her daughter Pearl's poetry, lines that tried to soften a life of calculated violence into something resembling tragedy. The mythology that grew around Belle in the decades after her death tells us more about what America wanted from its frontier stories than about what actually happened in the borderlands. Dime novels published in the 1890s transformed her into a romantic figure, a woman wronged by society and driven to outlawry by love and loss, a narrative that conveniently ignored her role in a criminal economy built on stolen livestock, intimidation, and the exploitation of legal chaos. The real Belle Starr was neither a romantic heroine nor a simple villain. She was a product of specific historical forces: the collapse of social order during the Civil War, the dispossession of native tribes and the legal vacuums that created, the networks of ex-Confederate guerrillas who refused to accept federal authority, and the gendered limitations that made outlaw life one of the few paths available to a woman seeking autonomy in a world structured to deny it. Understanding Belle requires understanding the Indian Territory itself, a region that existed in a state of permanent exception. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the federal government had relocated dozens of tribes to lands west of the Mississippi, promising them sovereignty in exchange for their eastern territories by the 1870s. Those promises were crumbling under pressure from white settlers, railroad companies, and political movements demanding that Indian lands be opened for homesteading. The territory became a refuge for anyone fleeing jurisdiction elsewhere, a place where tribal courts, federal marshals, and local posses all claimed authority, but none could enforce it consistently. Into this legal vacuum flowed outlaws, con artists, and desperate families, all betting that distance and bureaucratic confusion would keep them ahead of the law. Belle Starr thrived in that environment not because she was the deadliest gunfighter or the most ruthless criminal, but because she understood systems and how to move between them, how to marry into tribal communities for legal cover, how to leverage her gender when it helped and defy it when necessary, and how to manage information in a world where reputation and rumor could be as valuable as stolen gold. The economic foundation of her outlaw career was horse theft, an industry that connected the frontier territories to distant markets in ways most people never considered. A horse stolen in Kansas could be rebranded and sold in Texas within a week. Its value doubled by the distance and the buyer's willingness to ignore provenance. Belle's ranch was positioned along routes that connected these markets, and she maintained relationships with buyers who knew better than to ask questions. Federal authorities estimated that organized horse theft networks cost ranchers and settlers hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in the 1880s, destabilizing local economies and fueling vigilante violence. Posses formed by ranchers often bypassed legal process entirely, hanging suspected thieves from the nearest tree, and the absence of reliable law enforcement meant that accusations alone could be a death sentence. Belle navigated this world by cultivating alliances, by making herself useful to people on both sides of the law, and by ensuring that betraying her carried costs. Her willingness to inform on former associates late in her life was a survival calculation that reveals the fragility of outlaw networks. By the late 1880s, Judge Parker's court in Fort Smith had expanded its reach, employing a small army of deputy marshals who rode circuits through the Indian Territory, making arrests and dragging suspects back for trial. Parker himself was a complex figure, a federal appointee determined to impose order on a region he saw as lawless, and his court became famous for its high conviction rates and frequent use of the death penalty. Between 1875 and 1896, Parker sentenced 160 people to hang, though appeals and presidential commutations reduced the number actually executed to 79. Belle appeared before his court multiple times, and the transcripts show her playing the role of a wronged woman, a victim of circumstance, even as prosecutors laid out evidence of her ranch serving as an outlaw depot. She was convicted of horse theft in 1883 and served 9 months in a Detroit federal prison, a sentence light enough to suggest she had cooperated with authorities in ways the public record does not fully capture. The question of why Belle turned informant is tangled in the same motivations that drove much of her life: survival, calculation, and the recognition that loyalty in outlaw circles was always conditional. As federal enforcement intensified, the risk of remaining silent increased and the value of information rose. Belle had children to consider, property to protect, and a sharp enough mind to see that the era of freewheeling banditry in the Indian Territory was closing. Railroads were bringing more settlers, telegraph lines were connecting distant jurisdictions, and the legal ambiguities that had protected outlaws were being resolved in favor of federal control. Statehood for Oklahoma was still years away, but the mechanisms that would enable it were already in motion, and people like Belle, who had flourished in the chaos, faced a choice between adaptation and elimination. Her murder in 1889 can be understood as the collision of these forces: personal grudges sharpened by years of betrayal, economic stakes tied to land and livestock, and a broader societal shift toward formalized legal structures that left no room for people who had built lives in the margins. The failure to convict anyone for her killing was not an anomaly, but a reflection of how violence worked in the territories, where the state's capacity to investigate and prosecute was limited by resources, distance, and the reluctance of communities to cooperate with outside authorities. Belle's death barely made national news, a brief mention in papers that had once breathlessly chronicled her exploits, and within a few years she was being rewritten into legend. Her actual crimes softened into adventure, her alliances with native communities erased or simplified, her gender made into the story's central novelty rather than one element of a complex hustle. The long-term consequences of the world Belle inhabited extended far beyond her grave. The Indian Territory was dissolved in 1907 when Oklahoma achieved statehood, and the tribal sovereignty that had provided legal cover for outlaws and autonomy for native nations was sharply curtailed. The allotment policies that preceded statehood divided communal tribal lands into individual plots, opening millions of acres to white settlement and dispossessing native people of resources and political power. The outlaw networks that had flourished in the legal gaps of the 1870s and 1880s were dismantled by improved law enforcement. But the violence and dispossession that created those networks left scars that persisted for generations. Communities that had been destabilized by constant raiding, jurisdictional confusion, and economic disruption struggled to rebuild, and the myths that grew around figures like Belle Starr often obscured the structural forces that made their lives possible. Belle Starr's story endures not because she was the deadliest outlaw of the Old West, a title that by any measure belongs to men who killed far more people and stole far more money, but because her life exposes the mechanics of survival in a world being violently remade. She was a white woman who leveraged marriage to Native men for legal and economic advantage, a former Confederate sympathizer who navigated federal courts, a mother who raised children in outlaw camps, and a calculating operator who understood that in the absence of stable institutions, power flowed to those who could manage information, relationships, and violence. Her frontier was not the mythic landscape of cowboy films, but a bureaucratic nightmare of overlapping jurisdictions, a war zone where old hatred simmered, and a marketplace where human life and stolen property were traded with equal indifference. The fact that she died face down in the mud, killed by someone who was never named, tells the truth about frontier justice more clearly than 1,000-dime novels ever could.